The following is a collection of 7 amateur presentations done by members of the True Anime Discord community on areas of their passion or knowledge. There was a strict 25-minute time limit with 5 minutes of questions following. No one of us makes any claim of expertise to anime analysis or to public speaking. We hope, however, that something here strikes you as interesting.
Okay, it's great to see that everyone's here. So I'm doing my presentation on Made in Abyss, and it's to answer one simple question. Why has Made in Abyss resonated so much with its audience? So if you look at my anime list, what you'll find is that the anime is currently ranked number 20 overall, and the manga is ranked number 9. And so what that tells you is that there's something about this story that just resonates with its audience. And so I'm going to be and right now, and my proposal is that the reason this story resonates is because it tells the oldest story known to mankind. This right here is going to be the outline of the presentation. So I'll first start off with the importance of the stories, go through the hero's journey and archetypal themes, discuss what a catabasis is, which is a particular kind of story made of this is, and then provide some observations on the archetypes and how it works in the story. So, what's important to recognize is that humans are story driven creatures. So, if you look around the world, you'll notice that there's just a plethora of information. And so, for humans to be able to function as a life form, we have a need in order to condense and process and to identify which information is important and which is not. And so that shapes our perceptions, that shapes our entire being. What you see is that how we sort of understand information is through stories. One example is you can look at sort of the work of history. If you read a history book, it doesn't just state facts. It doesn't state this many people did this at this time on this date. What it does is that it crafts a narrative. Granted, the narrative is tied into what can be verified through historical evidence, but it does provide a story in which a person is able to understand what occurred. When you hold a conversation, when you try to explain something, what is noticeable is that we communicate through stories in which larger ideas are communicated in that manner. That's one of the reasons why Jesus Christ in the Bible uses parables in order to discuss his larger religious themes. He doesn't use philosophical discussions. He uses stories that are easily understood, but also have a wealth of information that can be dissected. So one fascinating aspect that you see about this is that because we're biologically inclined to identify patterns, we also have the ability to perceive patterns where they don't exist. And this also gives us the ability to even predict patterns or to predict, in which we can see the beginning of a pattern and then we can determine that, okay, once we see this, able to determine further on that this is what the what it will move further on. So the reason this is important is that when you look at oral traditions, when you look at the ancient writings, and the reasons why the old mythologies, like myths, are so important, is because there's a natural selection of stories. If you think about it, there's only so much memory that a community can have if you have an oral tradition. So before the era of the written word, only so much information can be remembered. And so that means that the stories that got passed down, the stories that got remembered for centuries, are the stories that contain the most important information. They had the things of most value to say. And those are the stories that ended up creating the mythology that underline ancient religions. It's the basis of the books in the Bible, stem from oral traditions. It's also the basis of books such as the Iliad and the Odyssey. And so those stories contain some of the most critical aspects, and that's where we're able to get these archetypes. So in that sense, the ancient archetypes are the distilled wisdom of centuries of human thought. And so, even though right now we're able to benefit from just centuries of thought and we're able to achieve great academic heights, in a biological sense, we're really not different than human beings would have been 5,000, even 10,000 years ago. And so it can assume that there was still at least the baseline intelligence was the same. It's just that they had less avenues in order to express those ideas. And so it is important to recognize that just because these ideas are old doesn't mean there's as much care. In which I would argue that because there are fewer stories that can be worked with, more care was put into them than what you'll find in modern stories. And so what you see with modern writing is that we've already established sort of a baseline of what makes a story, sort of the key ideas. And so a modern writing explores and expands upon older ideas, but it doesn't really replace it, in which there are fundamental baselines to it. I don't know how everyone is familiar with something like American football, but again, there's only so many things you can do. You can either pass the ball, you can run the ball, you can kick it, or you can punt it. Granted, within those four options of plays, there's endless variations and there's endless different philosophies, but the baseline is universal. And you can see that even within other sports and other ideas, the baseline is universal. And one other thing to note is that with modern writing, with the ability to actually um, with the ability to record much more, we see a lot of worse stories exist, which there is sort of a bias because the poor stories in the past just weren't able to survive. And so that is another important thing to note. So the first thing I'm going to discuss is going to be the hero's journey. So the hero's journey, this is really pushed by Joseph Campbell in his book, The Hero of a Thousand Faces. And so what he did is that he studied comparative religion, and he was able to determine that looking at religions all over the world, religions that really didn't have the means to be able to communicate, is that he was able to notice that there's these core ideas, or core sort of story points in which hit a story. And it's through that in which he's able to sort of establish the idea of the monomyth, in which this is like the general template of a story that resonates with humans. And so what this graphic does is that it describes sort of the general process where you get this call to adventure, supernatural aid, goes through, helps, challenges, temptations, but it basically describes how the hero starts in the known, moves to the unknown, faces serious challenges, overcomes those challenges, and then returns back to the known. That's the basic idea. What's important to recognize is that there really is no story that actually hits all of this, in which this is a template, and even ancient myths did not address every single point. And so the best way to look at the hero's journey is that this is sort of the roadmap in which a story can either take a left or a right or these certain points, or it can just even skip them altogether. So one key idea is that it isn't always necessary for the hero to actually return. Sometimes the journey fails. Sometimes the hero refuses to return. But the key is that is a key point, that once they get down to the abyss, once they reach the depth of the unknown, is that it does need to address whether or not they return, or whether they return or not. And so one key about, don't think about the hero's journey as something restrictive, sort of think it as it permissive, in a sense that it sort of helps refine like where the areas of focus should be. And so one key part about the hero's journey is that once you sort of gain knowledge of this, once you gain an understanding of journey of these stories, it gives you an expectations of what you can look at and give you the ability to gauge, to judge, and to understand a work. So one of my favorite stories is the Catabasis, and it's not that common of a story. What it is the descent to the underworld. So when you look at the image in the top left, this is the image of the Epic of Gilgamesh, and also it's the reason for the title. The Epic of Gilgamesh is the oldest known recorded story that humans have. Um, that story survived probably around 5 to 7 centuries of oral tradition before it was finally put together, and it describes the founding of the city. Gilgamesh was the founder of the ancient, I believe, the Babylonian society, and he was the greatest of heroes. Well, throughout his adventures, he realizes that he is mortal and that he is doomed to die, even regardless of all his strength. And so he ends up traveling to the underworld in order to get a flower that will be able to grant him eternal life. If you see to the next one over, you see it's also a theme that responds in Christianity, in which Dante's Inferno is probably the last great Catabasis, in which Dante Alighieri travels down to hell, then eventually moves to purgatory and up to heaven. And that is the last modern story of it. If you move to the next one to the right, you'll see the Greek story of Orpheus. So before he was the star in Matrix, he was actually one of the most he was the most famous musician in Greece, and he goes down to the underworld in order to receive his dead bride. You see at the bottom left, you see Hercules. One of his trials was to go defeat Cerberus down in the underworld, so he takes that journey. You see in the center right there, you see Odysseus goes down to the underworld in order to talk to his father. And then you see at the bottom right that even Jesus Christ, if you look at the Apostles' Creed, once he dies on the cross, he descends to hell for 3 days, in which he rescues all the souls, good souls that have died, and then brings them up to heaven. And so Jesus Christ does a catabasis. And to show that it's not just a Western tradition, if you look at the bottom picture, that is a story of, let me make sure I get the names right. That's the story of Izanagi and Izanami. And so these were the creating gods of Japanese mythology. These were the parents of the Mother Island. However, Izanami, the goddess, died in childbirth, and Izanagi descends to the underworld to try to rescue his bride. So what catabasis means is that it's ancient Greek for descent. In a literary context, it means a trip to the underworld. It does have other means in different contexts. So this is one of the greatest stories because it is a task that is only the most capable of individuals are actually able to accomplish. That's why you see so few of these stories in general. Now, one key thing to note is that these stories actually end in failure, or at least most of them do. Going back to this, Gilgamesh loses that flower and loses the opportunity in order to gain everlasting life. Orpheus is unable to return with his wife in the same manner that Izanami is unable to return with his wife. And indeed, the only people who seem to have success are people who go down to the underworld without the intent to actually try to bring anything back, but just goes down there for knowledge. Indeed, the only story that really shows a person being able to retrieve someone who has died from the underworld and bring them back is actually Jesus Christ, in a sense of bringing those people up to heaven. And so you can definitely see the religious connotations there. However, the idea of descent does have a broader influence, in which the idea of going to the dungeon, the idea of going to a cave, that is something common. That is something that you see in such stories like video games and things like that. However, there is an important distinction when you look at the difference between a catabasis, because it's important to recognize that it is the underworld, that it is about life and death. It isn't just going to the unknown, and is going to the land of the dead, which that is the key distinction. So now I'm finally get to discussing about Made in Abyss. But what makes Made in Abyss work is because what it does in its story is that it presents what the closest thing you can have to a hell within a secular manner. So you see the story in which they have scientific analysis of observable supernatural phenomenon, in which they go down into the abyss and they get an understanding of what the layers are like. They understand what the creatures are like. They understand what the effects are, even if they don't fully understand how those effects occur. And so while there still is a supernatural aspect to it, it is controlled, it's not controlled, it is understood, and it can be accounted for within a scientific manner. However, there is that clear point in which divides the realm of the living and the dead, in which there is a barrier that a person is unable to cross. And that is the defining line. If you look at sort of Greek mythology, you'll see that there are barriers to the underworld. You have the river Styx. You have Cerberus. You have various barriers that prevent living from entering to the land of the dead, and also from the dead journeying up to the land of living. However, from a symbolic point, there is a very enticing reason to try to go to the underworld. If you can be able to successfully conquer that barrier and travel at will, then you're able to gain untold knowledge. In which, if you could conquer death, then that opens the door in order to receive endless treasure and endless knowledge. And you see this is echoed within the story itself. So what you see, what are the two reasons that the climbers descend? One reason is that there's treasure in which they're looking to attain a goal, like some item. They're looking to attain something that'll be able to give them material power or material strength, or they can use in order to gain prestige. Another reason that you see is that there's just the desire of knowledge. They want to see what is beyond. They want to see what is beyond death, which again is a strong philosophical pursuit that many people throughout the ages have spent their time contemplating. And they go down to the abyss with the hope that they can conquer it. And so you see is that so what Made in Abyss does is that it prevents a very strong metaphor for the underworld, and it resonates with the audience because we have basically abstracted hell away, where very few people really believe in hell, and even the religious people just sort of see as hell as some sort of abstract idea. It's not some kind of physical place that they go. It's not a place where they really think of that they'll be suffering eternally, in which even discourse in religious thought has a very different view of hell than what would have been even 500 or 1,000 years ago. And so what that has happened is that in a storytelling aspect is that society has sort of lost respect for hell, lost respect for the idea of the underworld. But what Made in Abyss is able to do is able to sort of capture that essence of the feeling. And I think that's one reason why it resonates, is that it's not something that we really see. There is this terror that you get when you watch the story. There is something inherently wrong that you can feel within your gut that you just know is wrong, and it just entices you to keep on watching the story, that you want to see what happens, that you want to see what occurs. So to move on to some larger understanding of the archetypes, is that if we look at the hero's journey, we can also get a clearer idea of the story, and also get a sense of how Made in Abyss uses this well-established framework in order to build its story, in order to create and also defy expectations. So what you see at the beginning is that um, Riku and Reg have a very dubious call to adventure. So the reason she goes down to the underworld is that she just receives a note that I'll be waiting there. However, we hear later on that this looks like it was written by a different person than her mother. And so we don't know whether or not the call was legitimate. However, this call still started the adventure. And so that brings into doubt overall the entire success of the journey. And when you see the portion where she meets up with Ozen, now, that is a common idea in which you meet up with a mentor. However, she didn't really receive mentorship. She ended up having to go through a trial in which she and Reg had to survive for a given period of time within the second layer. However, there wasn't a moment where Ozen provided a clear guidance in order to make Riku and Reg more powerful. Her entire objective was just to give them an opportunity to better refine the skills they have, so that way they at least have the best opportunities in order to move forward. Granted, it is a practical reason for it, but when you look in the larger context of the story, it makes it very clear that those two are really not ready for their journey, and they're going to need more outsized luck in order to actually achieve success. Another key idea that you see in these stories is that heroes receive gifts of the goddess, in which they get items that are able to help them along their journey. However, if you look at the story, Riku she's a Butterfinger. She always seems to lose very important items. The first one they had was that compass that's always able to point direction down into the abyss. That was something she lost in the first layer. She ended up receiving the axe of her mother. That item was lost. And so what you see is that the items that are supposed to help them on the journey and be pivotal, while they may serve some immediate use, they are also easily destroyed or lost, and so they continue forward without it. And this raises the fundamental problem that you see with Riku, is that she isn't a hero. She isn't the hero in the archetypal sense. It could make a better argument that Reg is, but Riku clearly is not. And so this adds to the point that if she moves down to the abyss, there's no indication that she is even worthy of the journey. And so the only expectation is that she is going to suffer and eventually fail and die in the pursuit of her goal. And you can already see that for various points within the story, she has clearly suffered, but not to the point where she still can't move forward. However, this tension, this expectation of failure is something that's able to drive the story and drive the audience to crave more. Now, there are some very fascinating aspects to Made in Abyss, which I also feel is interesting to note. However, because the story is still ongoing and especially the anime is still behind from the manga, and I haven't even read the manga, that it's too early to tell how the final resolution of this will work. But one key idea is that Made in Abyss is very ancient, and I would even go so far as to say somewhat Greek in its manner of separating great from good. If you read the Iliad, Achilles is not a good person. He is not a good person morally. However, he is great. If you look at the ancient gods, they are not good beings. However, they are powerful, and that's what makes them deserving of respect. And so it is fascinating to see that there is not a moral equivalency to power, but there is an idea that power is a very important, and it drives the pecking order of the world. And that's a very ancient idea, but it is somewhat contrary to a more Western thought, which follows a much more Judeo-Christian observation of morality. I don't really know if that's going to mount much to anything, but that is something worth noting. My favorite observation comes from the revelation that Ozen provides to Riku, namely that Riku is a living corpse. So this is a spoiler, but I imagine people are sort of expecting to see spoilers in this. Is that Riku was a stillbirth, and so she was dead when she was born in the bottom of the abyss. However, when she is put in this box and transported up, by the time they get to the surface, she is alive. One of the implications of this is that Ozen has determined that dead beings that have been reanimated by this box have this natural desire to go down to the abyss. Now, this is something I don't like about the story because the abyss itself is already such a powerful entity and the world is already enamored within it that there doesn't need to be an extra means for Riku to actually go down into the abyss, in which her motivation presented early on, like the first 3 episodes, was more than enough, and that revelation doesn't add to the motivation. However, it does provide a key look into who Riku is as a character, because she is an animated corpse, both literally and figuratively. When you look at what makes Riku an effective character, her strength comes down into her knowledge. But this isn't knowledge gained from experience, it's knowledge that she's gained from reading and from researching about the abyss. And so, in essence, she is just a mouthpiece for the voices of the dead climbers that have already gone before her. And so she is not an original person. She does not have power of herself. All her power comes through the dead that she is able to give voice to. And so this raises a key question about what moves forward, because eventually reaches the point that her knowledge can only go so far. And so it will be interesting to see who she will be once she has past this, and if she can be more than just a mouthpiece for the dead, if she has anything within herself that allows her in order to step forward and become a hero. However, that's going to be one of the key ideas that needs to be explored. But at the end of the day, when you look at it, as I stated earlier, Made in Abyss is clearly dressed as a tragedy, but we don't know what it's going to be. And it's this tragic feeling that is underpinning this entire story that is able to, that gives it this, that gives it that sort of sour taste that keeps us coming back. So I'm just up about done with time. So I'll now open the Discord for questions. Looks like I left everyone speechless. Awesome.
Thank you, Phaeton. Maybe perhaps people are writing questions into chat. It's a little unclear, but that was great. Thank you. If at any point you have any questions, I'm not sure if Phaeton will be sticking around, but if you have any questions about the things that he's mentioned, or if you want to have any further questions, or you don't want to ask him publicly in chat, then feel free to ping him or message him directly.